David Torres thought his life couldn't get any worse. Working 2 soul-crushing jobs just to keep a roof over his 8-year-old daughter's head. Barely scraping together rent money every month for a landlord who seemed determined to bleed him dry. Every day was a struggle between exhaustion and desperation. Then came that storm. Rain hammering the city like bullets. Lightning turning night into day for split seconds before plunging everything back into darkness. David was alone in that empty office building, counting down the hours until his security shift ended, when he heard something that changed everything. A sound that didn't belong. Urgent. Human. Someone was outside in the storm, and they were in serious trouble. What David found on that rain-soaked sidewalk was an elderly man in an expensive suit, clutching a mysterious briefcase like his life depended on it. The man was terrified, mumbling about files and secrets, convinced that dangerous people were hunting him. He was injured, disoriented, and completely vulnerable. David had a choice. Walk away and pretend he'd seen nothing. Or help a complete stranger who might be bringing unknown dangers into his already complicated life. David made his choice in seconds, never imagining that this single act of kindness would trigger a chain of events that would expose a criminal empire, bring down corrupt officials, and transform his family's future in ways he never could have dreamed. 3 days later, when the FBI called, David realized that helping that stranger in the storm was either the best decision he'd ever made, or the biggest mistake of his life. What happened next would determine which one it was. David Torres stared at the digital clock on his security desk. 2:47 a.m. The rain hammered against the office building windows like angry fists demanding entry. He rubbed his tired eyes and took another sip of his 3rd cup of coffee. This was his reality now. Days spent loading trucks at the warehouse, nights guarding empty office floors. 2 jobs to keep a roof over Emma's head. His 8-year-old daughter was probably fast asleep in her bed right now, clutching that worn stuffed elephant she refused to throw away. Mrs. Patterson from next door watched Emma during these overnight shifts. David paid her $20 he could barely spare, but what choice did he have? Single fathers don't get the luxury of normal working hours. The building creaked and settled around him. 43 floors of corporate dreams and broken promises. David knew this place better than his own apartment. Every hallway, every emergency exit, every loose ceiling tile that dripped when it rained hard like tonight. He'd been walking these rounds for 8 months now, ever since Jessica left them both behind for her new life in California. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife. Emma's birthday is next month. Don't forget. As if he could forget his own daughter's 9th birthday. As if he hadn't been saving every spare dollar for the bike she wanted. The pink one with the streamers on the handlebars that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. David stood up and stretched his aching back. Time for the 3 a.m. security round. Floors 20 through 30 tonight. The elevator hummed as it carried him up through the sleeping building. He stepped out onto the 21st floor and began his routine walk through the maze of cubicles and corner offices. These people had no idea how good they had it. Climate-controlled offices, health insurance, vacation days. David walked past desks covered with family photos and coffee mugs with motivational quotes. World's best dad. One mug proclaimed from a desk covered in sticky notes. David wondered if that dad got to tuck his kids in every night. The rain grew louder against the windows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the city skyline for brief moments before plunging everything back into darkness. David continued his rounds, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallways. By the time he finished floor 30, it was nearly 4 a.m. The storm was getting worse. David could hear thunder rolling across the city like a freight train. He made his way back to the security office, ready to count down the hours until his shift ended at 6 a.m. Then home to wake Emma, make her breakfast, get her ready for school, grab 2 hours of sleep, and head to the warehouse by noon. This was his life now. Survival mode, 24 hours a day. David settled back into his chair and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through job listings, searching for something better. Something that paid enough to quit one of these jobs. Something that would let him be home when Emma went to bed. The opportunities were few and far between for a guy with only a high school diploma and no connections. The security monitors showed empty hallways and vacant offices. Nothing unusual. Nothing that required his attention. Just another quiet night in a building full of other people's dreams. Then the lightning struck close. Really close. The building's lights flickered, and for a moment, David thought they might lose power completely. The thunder that followed shook the windows. He looked outside and saw the storm was directly overhead now, unleashing everything it had on the city below. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not thunder, not rain, not the normal building noises he'd grown accustomed to. This was different. Urgent. Almost like someone calling for help. David stood up and listened carefully. There it was again. Faint but definitely human. Someone was outside the building, and they were in trouble. He grabbed his flashlight and security keys, then headed for the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the storm hit him like a wall. Rain soaked through his uniform shirt in seconds. The wind nearly knocked him backward. "Hello," David called out into the storm. "Is someone there?" Lightning illuminated the area in front of the building, and David saw him. An elderly man in an expensive suit collapsed on the sidewalk about 30 feet from the entrance. He was clutching something against his chest and appeared to be struggling to get up. David ran through the rain without hesitation. The man was probably in his late 60s, well-dressed despite being soaked to the bone. His gray hair was plastered against his head, and his face was pale with exhaustion or pain. "Sir, are you okay?" David knelt beside the man, shielding him from the worst of the rain with his own body. The elderly man looked up at David with confused, frightened eyes. "They can't know," he mumbled, his words barely audible over the storm. "The files, they can't know about the files." David noticed the man was clutching an old leather briefcase against his chest like his life depended on it. His grip was so tight his knuckles had turned white. "Sir, I'm going to help you," David said, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the thunder. "My name is David. I work security here. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" The man tried to sit up but couldn't manage it. His breathing was labored, and he seemed disoriented. David could see this wasn't just about being caught in the rain. This man needed serious help. "I'm calling an ambulance," David said, already pulling out his phone. "No." The man grabbed David's wrist with surprising strength. "They'll find me. They'll know where I am." David looked at the man's face more carefully. Despite his confusion, there was intelligence in his eyes. This wasn't random rambling from someone having a mental break. This man was genuinely afraid of something. "Sir, you need medical attention," David said gently. "I can see you're scared, but you're going to get pneumonia out here if we don't get you inside and dry." The man studied David's face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he could be trusted. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, David saw something that made his heart skip. The man's shirt, visible through his open suit jacket, was stained with what looked like blood. "Oh God, you're hurt," David said. "I'm calling 911 right now." This time the man didn't try to stop him. David dialed emergency services while using his body to shield the injured man from the rain. 911, what's your emergency?" "I need an ambulance at 1479 Corporate Plaza downtown. I found an elderly man collapsed outside. He appears to be injured and disoriented." "Is the victim conscious?" David looked down at the man, who was staring up at him with those frightened but intelligent eyes. "Yes, he's conscious but confused. He seems to be in pain. Ambulance is on the way. Stay with the victim and keep him warm if possible." David ended the call and looked around. They were completely exposed out here, and the storm wasn't letting up. He made a decision. "Sir, I'm going to help you get inside where it's dry. The ambulance will be here soon, but we need to get you out of this rain." The man nodded weakly. David carefully helped him to his feet, noting how the man never loosened his grip on that briefcase. Whatever was inside it, the man considered it more important than his own safety. They made their way slowly toward the building entrance. The man leaned heavily on David, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet pavement. David could feel how thin and frail the man was beneath his soaked suit. Inside the building, David guided the man to a chair in the lobby and grabbed some towels from the security office. The man was shivering violently now, his lips tinged blue from cold and shock. "Here," David said, wrapping a towel around the man's shoulders. "The paramedics will be here any minute." For the first time, the man seemed to really see David. He squinted at the name badge on David's uniform shirt. "David Torres," the man read aloud, his voice stronger now that they were out of the storm. "That's right. What's your name, sir?" The man hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Vincent," he said finally. "Vincent Palmer." "Okay, Vincent. Can you tell me what happened to you? Are you hurt?" Vincent looked down at his shirt and seemed surprised to see the bloodstains. I'm not sure. I remember leaving the bank. Then there were men following me. I tried to lose them in the storm. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. Men were following you? Vincent, are you in some kind of trouble? Before Vincent could answer, they heard sirens approaching. The ambulance was here. David went to meet the paramedics at the door. 2 EMTs hurried in with their equipment, immediately taking charge of the situation. What do we have? The lead paramedic asked. Elderly male, found collapsed outside in the storm. He's conscious but disoriented. Appears to have some kind of injury. There's blood on his shirt. He says men were following him. The paramedics went to work, checking Vincent's vital signs and examining him for injuries. Vincent submitted to their care, but kept that briefcase clutched against his chest. Sir, we need to examine you properly, one of the paramedics said. Can you put that case down? No, Vincent said firmly. It stays with me. David watched the scene unfold, something nagging at him. This wasn't just a random mugging or medical emergency. Vincent Palmer was genuinely terrified of something, and whatever was in that briefcase was important enough to risk his life protecting. The paramedics determined that Vincent needed to be taken to the hospital for a full evaluation. As they prepared to transport him, Vincent grabbed David's arm. David Torres, Vincent said, his eyes intense and focused. Room 1247. If something happens to me, remember that. Room 1247. What do you mean? What's in room 1247? But the paramedics were already wheeling Vincent toward the ambulance. David followed them outside, not caring that he was getting soaked again. Wait, David called out. He pulled off his security jacket and handed it to Vincent. Here, take this. It's not much, but it'll help keep you warm. Vincent looked at the jacket, then at David's face. For a moment, his expression softened. You're a good man, David Torres, Vincent said. Better than you know. Thank you for helping a stranger. The ambulance doors closed, and David watched the vehicle disappear into the storm. He stood there in the rain for several minutes, replaying the encounter in his mind. Room 1247. What did that mean? A hotel room? An apartment? An office? And why had Vincent been so insistent that David remember it? David walked back into the building, his mind racing. He returned to his security station and tried to focus on his job, but he couldn't stop thinking about Vincent Palmer and that mysterious briefcase. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. By the time 6 a.m. arrived, the storm had moved on, leaving the city washed and gleaming in the early morning sunlight. David gathered his things and headed home to Emma. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That helping Vincent Palmer was going to change his life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. As he drove through the empty streets toward his apartment, David kept thinking about Vincent's words. Room 1247. If something happens to me, remember that. What was Vincent afraid would happen to him? And what was so important about room 1247? David had no way of knowing that in just 3 days he would find out. And when he did, everything he thought he knew about his quiet, predictable life would be turned completely upside down. 3 days passed like a slow-motion nightmare for David Torres. He couldn't stop thinking about Vincent Palmer and those haunting words. Room 1247. If something happens to me, remember that. Every time David closed his eyes, he saw Vincent's terrified face and that death grip on the leather briefcase. David tried calling the hospital twice to check on Vincent, but they wouldn't give him any information since he wasn't family. All they would say was that Vincent Palmer had been treated and released. That should have been good news, but something about the nurse's tone made David uneasy. On Wednesday morning, David was getting Emma ready for school when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him pick up. Is this David Torres? The voice was professional, authoritative. Yes, who is this? Agent Rodriguez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Torres, we need to talk. Are you available to meet this morning? David's blood turned to ice. The FBI. This was about Vincent Palmer. It had to be. Am I in trouble? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, sir, not at all. But we have some information about Vincent Palmer that you need to hear. Can you meet me at the Starbucks on 5th Street in an hour? David looked at Emma, who was eating her cereal and completely oblivious to the fact that her father's world was about to be turned upside down. I have to drop my daughter at school first. Can we make it 90 minutes? Of course. I'll be the guy in the navy suit reading the newspaper. And Mr. Torres? This conversation needs to stay between us for now. After dropping Emma at school, David drove to the Starbucks with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The FBI. What had he gotten himself into by helping Vincent? Was he going to be arrested? Would Emma end up in foster care? Agent Rodriguez was exactly where he said he'd be. Mid-40s, Hispanic, built like he spent serious time in the gym. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Torres. I know this must be confusing." They sat in a corner booth away from other customers. Rodriguez pulled out a badge and showed it to David, then set a small recording device on the table. "With your permission, I'd like to record our conversation. This is for your protection as much as ours." David nodded, though he had no idea what he was agreeing to. "First, let me tell you who Vincent Palmer really is," Rodriguez began. Judge Vincent Palmer, retired federal judge who served on the bench for 32 years. One of the most respected legal minds in the state. Judge Palmer? David's mind raced. That explained Vincent's obvious intelligence and the way he carried himself despite being terrified. After retirement, Judge Palmer became something of a crusader. He's been investigating corruption cases, building legal strategies to help victims of financial crimes. The work he's been doing is remarkable, but it's also made him some very dangerous enemies. Rodriguez opened a file folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man in his early 50s with cold eyes and an expensive suit. Richard Blackwood. Ever heard that name? David's stomach dropped. "He's my landlord." "I thought so." Judge Palmer has been building a case against Blackwood for 15 years. What started as a simple tenant complaint turned into one of the largest housing fraud investigations in state history. David stared at the photograph. Richard Blackwood. The man who raised his rent every 6 months. The man who ignored repair requests and threatened eviction whenever David complained about the broken heater or the leaking pipes. What kind of fraud? Rodriguez pulled out more documents. Bank statements, forged receipts, falsified inspection reports. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood owns 412 rental properties across the city. For the past 8 years, he's been systematically stealing from his tenants. Fake maintenance fees, illegal security deposits, fraudulent damage claims. He's stolen over $800,000 from families who could least afford to lose it. David felt sick. That's why my rent keeps going up. That's why he always finds something wrong with my apartment right before I'm supposed to get my deposit back. It gets worse. Blackwood has been bribing housing inspectors to overlook dangerous conditions. Faulty wiring, broken smoke detectors, structural damage. 3 families have been hospitalized because of unsafe conditions in Blackwood's properties. Rodriguez showed David a list of names. Dozens of families, most of them single parents and elderly people on fixed incomes. People just like David, struggling to make ends meet while Blackwood got rich off their desperation. Judge Palmer's own daughter and grandchildren were victims of Blackwood's scheme 5 years ago. They were evicted based on fraudulent damage claims, lost their deposit, and ended up homeless for 3 months. That's when Judge Palmer decided to take this case personally. "The briefcase," David said suddenly. "That's what was in it. Evidence against Blackwood. 15 years worth of evidence. Financial records, forged documents, recorded conversations with corrupt inspectors. Judge Palmer has been incredibly thorough. When this case goes to trial, Blackwood won't be able to buy his way out of it." David thought about Emma, about all the nights he'd worked double shifts to pay Blackwood's inflated rent. About the times he'd chosen between groceries and the illegal fees Blackwood demanded. "Why are you telling me this? What does this have to do with me helping Judge Palmer in the storm?" Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because Blackwood knows Judge Palmer has the evidence. He's been trying to get his hands on it for months. The night you found Judge Palmer, Blackwood's men had cornered him outside the bank where he keeps a safety deposit box. Someone attacked Judge Palmer? 3 men. They roughed him up, demanded he hand over the briefcase. Judge Palmer managed to get away, but he was injured and disoriented. That's why he collapsed outside your building." David remembered the blood on Vincent's shirt, the terror in his eyes. He thought they were still following him. They were. If you hadn't helped him, if you hadn't called that ambulance, Judge Palmer might not have survived the night. Those men were prepared to kill him for what he knows. The weight of what Rodriguez was saying hit David like a freight train. He'd saved Judge Palmer's life without even knowing it. But more than that, he'd helped preserve evidence that could bring down the man who'd been systematically destroying his own life. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. Something that directly affects you and your daughter. He pulled out another document. An eviction notice with David's name on it. Blackwood filed this yesterday. He's claiming you caused $15,000 in property damage to your apartment. Broken appliances, damaged floors, destroyed fixtures. All completely fabricated, of course. David stared at the notice in disbelief. $15,000? I can't afford that. I can barely afford rent as it is. Blackwood's planning to evict you and your daughter next week. He'll keep your security deposit, charge you for the fake damages, and probably sue you for even more money. It's the same pattern he's used on dozens of other families. The room started spinning. David thought about Emma, about where they would go if they lost their apartment. His parents were dead, Jessica was in California, and wouldn't help even if he asked. They had nowhere to go. Why is he targeting me specifically? I always pay my rent on time. I never cause trouble. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed David a news article. Local security guard saves stranger in storm. There was a photo of David helping Judge Palmer into the ambulance. Someone took this picture and posted it online. It went viral locally. Blackwood saw it and realized you were the one who helped Judge Palmer. He's accelerating his timeline because he's afraid. David felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Blackwood was going to destroy his family because David had done the right thing. Because he'd helped a stranger in need. What can I do? I don't have money for lawyers. I can't fight someone like Blackwood. That's where Judge Palmer comes in. When he heard what Blackwood was planning, he called us. Judge Palmer wants to help you, but we need your help too. Rodriguez pulled out a small electronic device. It looked like a pen, but David could see it was actually some kind of recording equipment. We need you to wear a wire when you meet with Blackwood. Get him talking about the fake damage charges, the illegal fees, anything that proves he's running a scam. Judge Palmer's evidence is solid, but having Blackwood confess on tape would seal the case. David stared at the device. You want me to spy on my landlord? The man who controls whether my daughter has a roof over her head. I know it's scary. But David, this is bigger than just you and Emma. 89 families are being victimized by Blackwood right now. Dozens more have already lost their homes because of his schemes. You have a chance to stop him. Rodriguez showed David more photos. Families living in their cars after being illegally evicted. Elderly people who'd lost their life savings to Blackwood's fake fees. Children forced to change schools when their families were displaced. Judge Palmer specifically requested that we ask you to help. He says you're the kind of person who does the right thing even when it's difficult. Even when it puts you at risk. David thought about Vincent Palmer, clutching that briefcase in the storm, risking his life to protect evidence that could help all these families. The old judge had been fighting this battle for 15 years, seeking justice for his own daughter and grandchildren. If I do this, if I help you get evidence against Blackwood, what happens to Emma and me? Even if you arrest him, I'll still be homeless. I'll still owe money I don't have. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they'd started talking. Judge Palmer thought you might ask that. He's been working with the state attorney general's office on this case. When Blackwood goes down, the state will seize all his properties and assets. Every family he's stolen from will be compensated. Compensated how? Full restitution of stolen money, plus damages. Based on our calculations, you're owed approximately $47,000 in illegal fees and fraudulent charges over the past 3 years. David couldn't speak. $47,000. That was more money than he'd ever seen in his life. That was Emma's college fund. That was the chance to quit one of his jobs and actually spend time with his daughter. There's more. Judge Palmer is starting a nonprofit organization to help families fight housing discrimination and fraud. He's offered you a position as head of security. The salary would be $68,000 a year plus benefits. David's head was spinning. This couldn't be real. 3 days ago, he was a struggling single father working 2 dead-end jobs. Now the FBI was offering him a chance to bring down his tormentor and completely change his life. Why would Judge Palmer do all this for me? I just helped him during a storm. Anyone would have done the same thing. Would they? Rodriguez asked. David, do you know how many people walked past Judge Palmer that night before you found him? The hospital security cameras show at least 12 people saw him collapsed on that sidewalk. They all kept walking. David remembered that night. The storm, the fear in Vincent's eyes, the way he'd clutched that briefcase like it contained the most important thing in the world. Because it did. You didn't just save Judge Palmer's life, Rodriguez continued. You saved 15 years of work. Evidence that will help dozens of families get justice. That briefcase contained everything we needed to bring down Blackwood's operation. Room 1247, David said suddenly. Judge Palmer kept saying room 1247. What was that about? Rodriguez chuckled. His safety deposit box number. Judge Palmer was worried he might not survive, so he was trying to tell you where to find the evidence. He was making you his backup plan. The full scope of what had happened was finally sinking in. Judge Palmer had trusted David with the location of evidence that could destroy Richard Blackwood. A complete stranger had put his life's work in David's hands based on nothing more than David's willingness to help someone in need. So what happens now? David asked. Now we set up the meeting with Blackwood. You're going to call him and say you want to discuss the eviction notice. Tell him you're willing to pay the damages if he'll work with you on a payment plan. He'll think you're desperate and scared. That's when he'll get overconfident and start talking. Rodriguez handed David a business card. Think about it tonight. Talk to Emma if you need to, but remember that this conversation has to stay confidential. Blackwood has sources everywhere, including some corrupt cops who've been taking his money. David looked at the card. Agent Rodriguez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 weeks ago, the scariest thing in David's life was the possibility of not making rent on time. Now he was being recruited to help bring down a criminal empire. How do I know this isn't some kind of setup? How do I know you're really FBI? Rodriguez stood up and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and handed the phone to David. David Torres? The voice on the other end was familiar. Judge Palmer? Agent Rodriguez is legitimate, David. Everything he's told you is true. I know this is overwhelming, but you've already done the hardest part. You've already chosen to help when it mattered most. Judge Palmer, I don't know if I'm brave enough for this. You are. You proved that 3 nights ago in the storm. You're exactly the kind of person this world needs more of. Someone who helps strangers without expecting anything in return. David felt tears welling up in his eyes. I was just doing what anyone should do. But you were the only one who did it. That makes all the difference. After David hung up, he sat in silence for several minutes. Rodriguez waited patiently, understanding that this was the biggest decision David had ever had to make. If I do this, David said finally, if I help you get Blackwood, you swear Emma and I will be safe? You have my word. And Judge Palmer's. And the full protection of the federal government. David thought about Emma, about the bike she wanted for her birthday, about all the nights he'd worked double shifts to pay Richard Blackwood's illegal fees, about all the families who'd been destroyed by Blackwood's greed. He thought about Judge Palmer, an elderly man who'd spent 15 years fighting for justice for his daughter and grandchildren. A man who'd risked his life protecting evidence that could help dozens of innocent families. Most of all, he thought about that moment in the storm when he'd found Vincent Palmer collapsed and afraid. David had helped without thinking, without calculating the cost or benefit. He'd helped because it was the right thing to do. Now he had a chance to finish what that moment had started. Okay, David said, his voice steady and determined. Let's bring down Richard Blackwood. Rodriguez smiled and shook David's hand. Judge Palmer was right about you, David Torres. You're going to change a lot of lives. As David drove home to pick up Emma from school, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he had real hope. Hope for justice, hope for a better future, hope that good people could win against impossible odds. He had no idea that the next 48 hours would test that hope in ways he'd never imagined. But he also had no idea just how powerful karma could be when it finally decided to balance the scales. David Torres spent Thursday night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The recording device Agent Rodriguez had given him sat on his nightstand like a small bomb waiting to explode. Tomorrow morning, he would call Richard Blackwood and arrange a meeting that could either save his family or destroy them completely. Emma was fast asleep in the next room, completely unaware that her father was about to risk everything to bring down the man who'd been slowly crushing their lives for 3 years. David had considered telling her what was happening, but how do you explain to an 8-year-old that Daddy is going undercover for the FBI? At 6 a.m., David's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rodriguez. Equipment test at 8 a.m. Coffee shop on Elm Street. Are you ready for this? David replied with a simple, yes, though he'd never felt less ready for anything in his life. After dropping Emma at school, David met Rodriguez at the designated coffee shop. The agent looked refreshed and confident, like this was just another day at the office for him. How are you feeling? Rodriguez asked as they sat in a corner booth. Terrified, David admitted. I kept thinking about what happens if Blackwood figures out what I'm doing. He won't. Blackwood thinks you're just another desperate tenant trying to avoid eviction. His arrogance is his weakness. He's gotten away with this scheme for so long that he believes he's untouchable. Rodriguez pulled out what looked like an ordinary ballpoint pen. This is a state-of-the-art recording device. Voice-activated, 8-hour battery life, transmits in real time to our monitoring station. We'll be listening to everything. David took the pen, surprised by how normal it felt. How does it work? Just keep it in your shirt pocket. The microphone is in the clip. It'll pick up conversations from up to 20 feet away. If you feel like you're in danger at any point, click the pen 3 times quickly. That's the signal for our tactical team to move in. The weight of what he was about to do hit David again. Federal agents would be listening to his conversation. There was a tactical team standing by in case things went wrong. This wasn't just about his rent anymore. This was a major law enforcement operation. What exactly do I need to get Blackwood to say? David asked. Rodriguez pulled out a notepad. We need him to admit to falsifying the damage report. We need him to discuss the illegal fees he's been charging you. If you can get him to talk about other tenants he's scammed, even better. The more he reveals about his operation, the stronger our case becomes. David practiced the conversation several times with Rodriguez coaching him. Keep Blackwood talking. Act desperate but not suspicious. Get him to explain his charges in detail. Make him feel like he's in control. Remember, Rodriguez said as they prepared to leave, you're not alone in this. Judge Palmer specifically chose you because he believes you can handle it. Don't let fear override your judgment. At 10 a.m., David made the call that would change everything. Blackwood Property Management, this is Richard speaking. The voice was smooth, professional, with just a hint of condescension that David had learned to hate over the years. Mr. Blackwood, this is David Torres. I got your eviction notice yesterday. I was hoping we could meet to discuss it. Ah, Mr. Torres. I was wondering when you'd call. $15,000 in damages is quite serious, wouldn't you say? David forced himself to sound defeated. I don't understand how the damages could be so high. I've taken good care of the apartment. Well, that's not what my inspection report shows. But I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Torres. Perhaps we can work something out. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Say 2 p.m. I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Oh, and Mr. Torres? Bring your checkbook. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that works for both of us. The line went dead, and David sat staring at his phone. Blackwood's tone had been almost gleeful, like he was looking forward to their meeting. David wondered how many other desperate parents Blackwood had summoned to his office over the years. Rodriguez called 20 minutes later. We heard the conversation. You did great. He's already showing his hand by mentioning arrangements and asking you to bring your checkbook. That suggests he's planning to extort money from you. What if he asks me questions I can't answer? What if he gets suspicious? Trust your instincts. You've been dealing with this man for 3 years. You know how he operates. Just be yourself, be desperate, and let his greed do the rest. David spent the next few hours trying to distract himself by doing normal things. He went grocery shopping, paid bills, cleaned the apartment. But his mind kept racing through possible scenarios. What if Blackwood discovered the recording device? What if he had security cameras in his office? What if David said something that made Blackwood suspicious? At 1:30 p.m., David drove to Blackwood's office building downtown. It was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, the kind of place that screamed money and power. David had only been here once before, when he'd first signed his lease 3 years ago. Back then, he'd been impressed by the luxury. Now it just reminded him of how much money Blackwood had stolen from families like his. The elevator carried David to the 40th floor, where Blackwood Property Management occupied a suite of offices with panoramic views of the city. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an expensive dress, barely looked up when David announced himself. Mr. Blackwood will see you now, she said, gesturing toward a set of mahogany doors. Richard Blackwood's office was exactly what David had expected. Massive desk, leather furniture, walls covered with awards and photos of Blackwood shaking hands with politicians and business leaders. The man himself was in his early 50s, well-dressed and perfectly groomed, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Torres, please have a seat. Blackwood gestured to a chair positioned directly across from his desk. David noticed that Blackwood's chair was slightly elevated, forcing visitors to look up at him. Everything about this office was designed to intimidate. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Blackwood. I have to admit, I'm pretty confused about this damage report. Blackwood opened a file folder and spread several photographs across his desk. They showed David's apartment, but the images had clearly been manipulated. Scuff marks on walls that David knew had been there when he moved in. Scratches on hardwood floors that looked suspiciously fresh. A broken kitchen cabinet door that David was certain had been intact the last time he'd seen it. As you can see, the damage is quite extensive, Blackwood said, his tone suggesting that he was being perfectly reasonable. $15,000 is actually conservative. I could have charged you much more. David picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully. Mr. Blackwood, I don't remember this damage being in my apartment. Some of these scratches and marks look new. Blackwood's smile widened. Mr. Torres, I understand that tenants sometimes forget about damage they've caused over time. It's natural to want to minimize your responsibility. But my inspection team is very thorough. Your inspection team? I employ the best property inspectors in the city. They document everything. Every scratch, every stain, every sign of wear and tear that goes beyond normal use. David felt the recording device in his pocket and remembered Agent Rodriguez's instructions. Get Blackwood talking about his process. Make him explain how his scam works. I'm just trying to understand how $15,000 worth of damage could happen without me noticing. Could you walk me through how your inspection team works? Blackwood leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain his superior methods. It's all about knowing what to look for, Mr. Torres. My team has been doing this for years. They know how to spot damage that tenants might overlook or try to hide. Do they take before and after photos? Absolutely. We document everything when tenants move in and when they move out. The difference between those two sets of photos determines the damage charges. David knew this was a lie. He'd never seen any photos taken when he moved in, and no one had been in his apartment recently to take after photos. I don't remember anyone taking photos when I moved in 3 years ago. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but David caught a flash of something cold in his eyes. All my properties are photographed, Mr. Torres. It's standard procedure. Could I see the before photos of my apartment? I'd like to compare them to these damaged photos. For the first time, Blackwood looked uncomfortable. Those records are archived. It would take time to retrieve them. David pressed forward, sensing an opening. It's just that some of this damage looks like it might have been there when I moved in. If I could see the original photos, maybe we could reduce the damage charges. Blackwood stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. When he turned back to face David, his expression had hardened. Mr. Torres, let me be frank with you. You're a single father working 2 jobs to make ends meet. You live paycheck to paycheck. You can't afford to fight me on this, and we both know it. The mask was starting to slip. This was the real Richard Blackwood, the predator who targeted vulnerable families because he knew they couldn't fight back. I'm not trying to fight you, Mr. Blackwood. I just want to understand the charges. The charges are what they are because I say they are. Blackwood returned to his seat, his tone becoming more aggressive. I own 400 properties in this city. I've been in this business for 15 years. Do you really think some warehouse worker is going to tell me how to run my company? David felt anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to stay calm. I'm just asking questions. And I'm giving you answers. $15,000 in damages. Plus the 3 months back rent you'll owe while I find a new tenant. Plus legal fees for the eviction process. We're looking at about $25,000 total. $25,000? But I'm current on my rent. Blackwood laughed, and the sound was cruel. Current according to whom? My records show you're 3 months behind. Have been for quite some time. David's mind raced. His rent receipts were at home, but he knew he was current. Blackwood was fabricating debt that didn't exist. I have receipts showing all my rent payments. Receipts can be forged, Mr. Torres. My computer records are what matter legally. The scope of Blackwood's corruption was becoming clear. He wasn't just charging fake damage fees. He was altering rent records, creating false debt, manufacturing evidence to justify stealing from his tenants. How many other tenants owe back rent according to your computer records? David asked. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. That's confidential information. I'm just wondering if this is a common problem. Maybe there's an issue with your accounting system. There's no issue with my system, Mr. Torres. The issue is with tenants who don't pay their obligations and then act surprised when there are consequences. David decided to take a bigger risk. Have you ever had tenants dispute these damage charges successfully? Never, because the charges are always legitimate. What about tenants who've taken you to court? Blackwood's face darkened. A few have tried. It never ends well for them. I have the best lawyers money can buy. Tenants like you can't afford legal representation that could challenge my documentation. So you've never lost a case? Not once. And do you know why? Because I'm very careful about choosing my battles. I target people who can't fight back. Single mothers, elderly people on fixed incomes, immigrants who don't understand the system. People who have no choice but to pay whatever I charge them. David felt his heart pounding. Blackwood was confessing to everything, explaining his entire predatory system with casual arrogance. That seems like a smart business strategy, David said, hating himself for the words. It is. This business is about understanding power dynamics, Mr. Torres. I have all the power. My tenants have none. That's what makes it so profitable. Blackwood walked around his desk and sat on the edge, looking down at David. Which brings us back to your situation. $25,000 is what you owe me. Obviously, you can't pay it all at once. But I'm prepared to be reasonable. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? You sign over the title to your car. That covers about $8,000. You agree to work for me part-time on weekends, cleaning my rental properties. That covers another $10,000 over the next 2 years. And you forfeit your security deposit and any claim to tenant rights in the future. That covers the remaining $7,000. David stared at Blackwood in disbelief. You want me to give you my car and work for free? Not for free. I'll pay you minimum wage for the cleaning work. But all of that money goes toward your debt to me. And if I refuse? Blackwood's smile turned predatory. Then I evict you immediately, sue you for the full amount, garnish your wages at both jobs, and destroy your credit for the next 7 years. Your daughter will grow up knowing that her father is a deadbeat who can't meet his obligations. The threat against Emma was too much. David felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay in character. How long do I have to decide? You don't. You decide right now, or I start eviction proceedings this afternoon. David pretended to consider the options, buying time to let Blackwood continue talking. You know, Mr. Torres, I've made this same offer to dozens of tenants over the years. Most of them are smart enough to take it. The ones who don't. Blackwood shrugged. Well, let's just say it doesn't work out well for them. What happened to the ones who didn't take your deal? There's a family living in their car right now because the father thought he could fight me in court. Took everything they had just to hire a lawyer, and they still lost. The grandmother on Maple Street who used to babysit for half the neighborhood? She's in a nursing home now because she couldn't afford rent after I sued her for damages. Blackwood was describing his victims like trophies, completely oblivious to the human cost of his actions. I've been doing this for 15 years, Mr. Torres. I've perfected the system. I know exactly how much I can steal from people before they break completely. It's all about finding that sweet spot where they can't fight back, but they can still make payments. David realized that Blackwood wasn't just admitting to fraud. He was bragging about it. His arrogance had completely overridden his caution. How do you avoid getting caught? David asked. Don't some tenants complain to the housing authority? Blackwood laughed. The housing authority? Mr. Torres, I contribute to the campaigns of half the city council. The head of the housing authority plays golf at my country club. I have inspectors on my payroll who will certify whatever I need them to certify. You bribe city officials? I prefer to think of it as building relationships. But yes, I pay people to look the other way. It's just the cost of doing business. David felt like he was listening to a confession from the most evil landlord in the city. Blackwood was admitting to fraud, bribery, extortion, and systematic abuse of vulnerable families. What about the police? Don't they investigate complaints? I have friends in the police department too. Detective Morrison in particular has been very helpful over the years. Whenever tenants try to file complaints against me, he makes sure those complaints get lost in the system. Blackwood was revealing a network of corruption that went far beyond simple rent fraud. He was describing a criminal enterprise that had infected multiple levels of city government. You seem to have thought of everything, David said. That's what separates successful businessmen from failures, Mr. Torres. I don't leave anything to chance. Blackwood returned to his chair and pulled out a contract. This agreement outlines everything we've discussed. Car title, work arrangement, forfeiture of rights. Sign it now, and we can put this unpleasantness behind us. David looked at the contract, pretending to read it while his mind raced. Blackwood had confessed to everything Agent Rodriguez needed. Fraud, bribery, extortion, conspiracy. The recording device had captured it all. "I need to think about this," David said. Blackwood's expression turned cold. "There's nothing to think about. Sign the contract or face the consequences. What if I can't make the payments? What if I lose one of my jobs? Then I take everything you have left. Your bank account, your furniture, anything of value. I've done it before. How many families have you destroyed this way?" Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious pride. 87 families in the past 5 years. Single mothers, elderly couples, disabled veterans. The more vulnerable they are, the easier it is to take everything from them. David felt sick. 87 families. Hundreds of people whose lives had been ruined by the man sitting across from him. "You keep count." "Of course I keep count. It's important to track your success metrics in any business." David realized that Blackwood wasn't just evil. He was completely disconnected from the human consequences of his actions. These weren't people to him. They were just numbers in a ledger. "Mr. Blackwood, what you're describing sounds illegal." Blackwood's laugh was cold and ugly. "Illegal according to whom? The laws are written by politicians I fund. The courts are run by judges who owe me favors. The police look the other way because I pay them to. What I'm doing isn't illegal, Mr. Torres. It's just business." At that moment, David heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps in the hallway outside Blackwood's office. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. Blackwood heard them too. His expression changed from arrogant confidence to sudden concern. "Are you expecting someone?" David asked. Before Blackwood could answer, his office door burst open. Agent Rodriguez entered first, followed by 6 other federal agents in tactical gear. All of them had weapons drawn. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, bribery, and conspiracy," Rodriguez announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Blackwood's face went white. He looked at David with sudden understanding. "You're wearing a wire." David stood up and pulled the recording device from his pocket. "Everything you said is on tape. Every confession, every admission, every detail about your criminal operation. You can't do this to me." Blackwood screamed as the agents moved to handcuff him. "I have connections. I have friends in high places." "Not anymore," Rodriguez said. "Detective Morrison was arrested an hour ago. So were 3 city councilmen and the head of the housing authority. Your entire network is finished." As the agents led Blackwood away, he turned back to David one last time. "You have no idea what you've done. I'll destroy you for this. I'll take everything you have." Rodriguez stepped between them. "Mr. Blackwood, the only person who's losing everything today is you." After Blackwood was removed from the office, Rodriguez turned to David with a smile. "You did it. That was one of the most complete confessions I've ever heard. Blackwood just handed us everything we needed to dismantle his entire operation." David sat down heavily, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "Is it really over? For Blackwood?" "Absolutely. He's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. For you and Emma? It's just beginning." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and made a call. "Judge Palmer? It's done. David got everything we needed and more." He handed the phone to David. Judge Palmer's voice was warm with gratitude. "David, I can't thank you enough. What you did today will save dozens of families from the same fate my daughter and grandchildren suffered." "I was terrified the whole time," David admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite the fear. You've shown more courage today than most people show in a lifetime." Over the next 2 hours, more federal agents arrived to search Blackwood's office and seize his records. David gave a formal statement, detailing everything that had happened during the meeting. Rodriguez explained what would happen next. Blackwood's assets will be frozen pending the outcome of his trial. All his properties will be placed in federal receivership. Within 60 days, every family he defrauded will receive full restitution. "What about my apartment? Can Emma and I stay?" "Not only can you stay, but the federal government is transferring ownership of your building to a non-profit housing organization. Your rent will be reduced to fair market value, and all of Blackwood's fake charges will be eliminated from your record." David felt tears welling up in his eyes. "And the job Judge Palmer mentioned? Starts Monday if you want it. $68,000 a year, full benefits, helping families fight housing discrimination. Judge Palmer says you're exactly the kind of person he needs on his team." As David drove home to pick up Emma from school, he couldn't stop smiling. In 3 days, his entire life had been transformed. The man who'd been systematically destroying his family was now facing decades in prison. David had a new job that paid more than both his old jobs combined. Emma would never have to worry about being evicted again. But more than that, David had helped bring justice to 89 families who'd been victimized by Blackwood's greed. Children who'd been forced to live in cars would have homes again. Elderly people who'd lost their life savings would be compensated. Families torn apart by Blackwood's cruelty would be made whole. When David picked up Emma from school, she immediately noticed his mood. "Daddy, you seem really happy today." "I am happy, sweetheart. Really, really happy. Did something good happen?" David thought about how to explain it in terms an 8-year-old could understand. "Remember how our landlord was mean to us? Well, it turns out he was mean to a lot of families. Today, some very important people made sure he can't be mean to anyone anymore." "Is that why you don't have to work tonight?" David realized he'd never told Emma he was quitting his overnight security job. "How did you know that?" "Because you're picking me up from school instead of Mrs. Patterson. And you're smiling like you did on Christmas morning." David laughed and hugged his daughter. "You're too smart for your own good." "Yes, I'm not working tonight. In fact, I'm not working that job anymore. I got a new job that pays better and lets me be home with you." "Does that mean we can get pizza for dinner?" "We can get pizza for dinner every night this week if you want." Emma clapped her hands with excitement. "This is the best day ever." As they drove home, David thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. 3 nights ago, he'd helped a stranger in a storm without expecting anything in return. That simple act of kindness had set in motion a series of events that not only transformed his own life, but brought justice to dozens of families. Judge Palmer had been right. Karma wasn't just about good things happening to good people. It was about how one act of goodness could ripple outward, creating more goodness, until evil was overwhelmed by the power of human decency. David's phone rang as they pulled into their apartment complex. It was Agent Rodriguez. "David, I thought you'd want to know. We've arrested 7 more people connected to Blackwood's operation. 3 more corrupt cops, 2 city officials, and 2 property inspectors who were taking bribes. How many families will get their money back?" 143 families so far, and we're still counting. The total restitution is going to be over $2 million. $2 million returned to families who desperately needed it. Children who would have food on the table. Parents who could afford medical care. Elderly people who could keep their homes. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "The mayor is creating a new position, Director of Tenant Rights and Housing Justice. Judge Palmer recommended you for the job. It pays $90,000 a year and comes with the authority to investigate housing fraud throughout the city." David couldn't speak. Director of Tenant Rights and Housing Justice. From security guard to city official in 3 days. "David, are you there?" "I'm here. I can't believe this is real." "It's real. You earned it. What you did took incredible courage, and now you'll be in a position to help even more families." That evening, David and Emma had pizza for dinner and watched her favorite movie. As Emma fell asleep curled up next to him on the couch, David reflected on everything that had happened. 3 days ago, he'd been a struggling single father with no hope for a better future. Tonight, he was a man who'd brought down a criminal empire and secured justice for dozens of families. Tomorrow, he would start a new career helping vulnerable people fight back against those who would exploit them. All because he'd helped a stranger in a storm. As David carried Emma to her bed, she stirred and mumbled sleepily. "Daddy, are you going to help more people like you helped that man in the rain?" "Yes, sweetheart. That's going to be my job now. Helping people who need help." Emma smiled and drifted back to sleep. David tucked her in and kissed her forehead, then sat by her window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard Blackwood was sitting in a federal detention center, probably still wondering how his perfect criminal enterprise had been destroyed by a security guard he'd tried to crush. Somewhere else, Judge Palmer was probably preparing for the dozens of court cases that would put Blackwood and his associates away for decades. And in apartments and houses throughout the city, families who'd been victimized by Blackwood's greed were going to sleep knowing that justice was finally coming. That their stolen money would be returned. That the man who'd made their lives miserable would never hurt anyone again. David's phone buzzed with one final text message. It was from Judge Palmer. "Thank you for reminding an old man that there are still heroes in this world. Vincent Palmer." David smiled and put his phone away. He wasn't a hero. He He was just a father who'd tried to do the right thing when it mattered most. But sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. Outside, it started to rain again. But this time, David wasn't worried about storms. He'd learned that even the worst storms eventually pass, and sometimes they bring unexpected gifts to those brave enough to help others weather them. Emma was safe, David had meaningful work ahead of him, and somewhere in the city, dozens of families would sleep peacefully knowing that justice had finally arrived. Karma, it turned out, was patient. But when it finally acted, it was absolutely devastating to those who deserved it and absolutely transformative for those who had earned it through simple human kindness. David Torres had helped a stranger in a storm. 3 days later, that stranger helped him change his life forever. And together, they'd brought down an empire built on cruelty and greed. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world is just one person willing to help another when it matters most.